Okay, so we're now live, and we are having a conversation about qualia and philosophy of mind, specifically in regards to whether or not they exist. I am joined by the realistic nihilist, animating rebel, and hopefully Derezzed 83 in this hangout, and we're just explaining our positions. So, yeah, I'm still a materialist, but what we were talking about was qualia realism versus qualia anti-realism. So Animating Rebel was saying that redness. Okay, so we're now live, and we are having a conversation about qualia. I apologize for that. Um, so we're discussing the difference between qualia realism and qualia anti-realism, and I was pointing out that there is sort of a confusion as to whether qualia themselves have properties or whether or not qualia are properties. So that was our discussion. So Anurab, continue.
Uh, right. So I think what the Qualia realist might be trying to say is that the property of redness, it is something different from a physical event or whatnot.
So you're
I
saying that,
think
yeah.
right, but they say that it has a different property, but I think they just mean that it's a different thing altogether.
But what's the difference between redness and red?
I don't really see why that matters. I was just
Because you're sort of making it its own concept. And when you describe redness, why don't you go further and talk about rednessness of red? Because you're already sort of extending that concept to a universal when you say that. Because what do you describe? Let me ask you, what are you describing when you talk about redness?
hmm. Well, when I talk about redness, I just it's like something you do when you take a bunch of different bits and kind of use just one word, you know, as a label for the whole family, so to speak. I'm not sure how, if I can put it into words, but
But what is that bit that you're talking about? Is that bit you're talking about red?
yeah, it could be like different shades of red,
But those are
for
different
example.
colors. Those are different colors altogether. So you're already
Correct, but there some are more similar than others. Like,
no, but you can't do that. You can't go by similarity and group them because that's an arbitrary grouping because th- are blue and green different colors, would you say?
yeah,
What
Oh,
rests on this? I'm not really sure what who cares if it's arbitrary. How does it matter whether it's arbitrary?
because
yeah.
there's nothing that you're talking about when because you're trying to universalize these concepts and not everyone has these concepts. So if not everyone has these concepts, then how can you say that they exist? To whom do they exist?
Well, I don't think them being relativized to a certain individual really matters, right? You don't have to universalize the concept. You could just use it in language as long as there's some sort of likeness. It doesn't really matter what, like whether it's universal to everybody. In
But
fact, I don't even think it makes sense to say uh, that there is a universal redness. There's just things that I call red, right? It doesn't even make sense because qualia are private, right? So
and they're subjective.
yeah,
But
I don't see how that's relevant. They might be subjective. I don't really. Well, I don't look. What would objective qualia mean? It
well,
wouldn't mean.
that's what I'm asking you because that's what you keep talking about when you call red. But
I don't know. I'm not talking about anything objective, right? If I'm talking about my mind and the contents of redness depend on what my mind arbitrates, then that's subjective, and I don't see a problem with that.
then when you're talking about redness, then how can you pin it down to any sort of for example, how do you know that the red you see now is the same as the red you saw yesterday and your memory hasn't just been inverted?
I don't see how it's really relevant, right? It's just something I use instrumentally.
But what are you pointing at?
What it's like to look at an object.
So you're just pointing at an experience, but that experience itself is not something that's all it boils down to when you look at it is just the representation you have of a particular wavelength of light. That's not, I mean, that's just what it is, but it's going to look to you how it looks to you. So I don't see why that's even why is that even a meaningful concept?
Hmm. Well, do you understand what it looks like to have an experience? Do you understand what it's like to have experience?
Do I
Do you
understand what it's well what it's like what
have
it's
an
like
experience?
is a subjective concept already, and there's no
Right.
such thing as a free floating what it's like. There's no such thing as what it's like to see red. It's only what it's like for you to label something as red, to recognize it. Your experiencing it. So, for example, this is what I offered to Derez. The Mary's room argument applied to music.
Well,
Something.
look, I don't think there's a fact of the matter about which qualitative state would be occurring or whatever. Like, that doesn't matter, but I think there would be a fact of the matter about whether or not one has quality, which is different.
Yeah, that's. I would completely agree with that.
You would. Can you say that again? Someone was
Well,
scratching.
there are two different propositions, right? There's a fact of the matter about what's read is one proposition, and then there's a fact of the matter about whether or not one has qualitative states, right? There's a fact of the matter about those. But just because there's no fact of the matter about which qualitative states one is having, it doesn't matter about whether or not they're like
There even is one at all, right?
right.
Yeah, but what are we talking about then? Because if we can't even pin them down in any sense, then it seems that there's no sense to be had in talking about them as if they're things, especially if we're talking about something that's ontologically and, and epistemically subjective. So what sense is
Just talking about like look, I don't get this whole push that just because something is subjective means it doesn't exist, right? Like I don't
I'm not saying
understand.
it doesn't exist. I'm saying that the concept
Well,
doesn't kind of
then it
meaning.
doesn't really seem like we disagree on anything, right? Because if you're saying that you have qualitative states, right, but your qualitative states are subjective, and I agree that I have qualitative states and my qualitative states are subjective, it doesn't seem like there's any disagreement there.
But I'm not. For example, in the Mary argument, would you say that Mary learns anything new?
I don't really know.
Well, I think she might learn something new in the sense of having some sort of I'm not sure how to say this. She learns as what it's like to experience a color that's not monochromatic, I guess.
This concept of what it's like is kind of a buzzword because you really. I mean, I tried to do this with Derezzed. Is what let's take the Mary case and apply it to music. If she heard middle C for the first time, or what we call middle C,
Hmm.
there. I don't. I'm trying to. Middle C is just a label, and we signify middle C because that we happen to use the Western tonal music system. But there's no such thing as a free-floating essence of experiencing middle C apart from a deployment of the concepts utilized in the Western tonal music system. If she was a part of if she was trained in the Javanese music system, she would perceive the stimulus that causes us to identify a particular sound or tone as middle C differently. So,
Okay, okay, but hang on a sec. Let's say that Mary's completely deaf, right? That
sure, yeah,
she's
sure,
never heard anything at all,
yes,
and she hears a middle C for the first time.
but she studies
Now,
the sounds, right? She
but
stu-
hang on. just a sec, let me finish. Alright, so no matter how relative that middle C is gonna sound, you know, it might sound different for me than it would for her. No matter how relative or different, they're still gonna fall under the same category of sound. There's still gonna be what it's likeness to hear anything at all.
But what are we talking about, though? Because when you say middle C, are you talking about the percept or the stimulus that causes it?
The percept.
Okay, but the percept only belongs to you.
All right,
Yeah,
all right, but I'm still
Look,
there's still a fact of the matter that I'm having this percept.
the intuition is really easy, right? Like I don't see how there's much of a contest, right? There are going to be some people who can't hear middle C, right? There are going to be people who don't have any perception of the note. Well, I mean, middle C, assuming that they can't feel it in other, like they can't feel the compression waves or something. Imagine.
Yeah.
Right. There's going to be a case. Some people aren't going to be able to hear it. Those people aren't going to know what it's like to hear middle C, but they can look at the same things as people who do have the perception of middle C, right, and understand them just as well, right? They can understand.
Actually, not true, because if you're trained in a different tonal music system, you're going to hear that particular note differently. If you're trained in a different tonal music...
No, I'm saying one person can hear a note, right?
Yes.
I call that note middle C. The other person cannot, right? But they can still know physical facts about that note, right?
Yes.
Like you can know that some people are going to, but that person is not going to know what it sounds like, right?
What it sounds like to whom?
To them, they're not going to know what it sounds like to anybody, right? They're not going to know.
I mean, you can't know what it sounds like to anybody in the first place because they're private. So
Right.
what it sounds like to whom? You can't just have a platonic essence of what it sounds like without a perspective.
No, well, I wouldn't say it's a platonic essence. I'm just going to say that they don't have. They're not going to have. They're going to behave differently, such that we would infer that they don't have any qualitative states with regard to that, right?
But they might. It's just that they're behaving differently because it depends on. Again, it depends on the tonal music system you happen to. You're assuming that you're applying the concept of middle C where it might not apply. You're applying that where someone might be trained in a different system of music and hear that differently. But there is no sort of essence of what it's like to hear middle C without the context, without considering that person's perspective. Outside of a perspective, it doesn't even make sense to talk about the percept of middle C. Why are you privileging the Western system over other systems of musical tonality? Why aren't you going after quarter tones or eighth tones or tones that don't exist in our music system that exist in others?
Well, I mean, it's not going to be the same tone. It's going to be the same tone no matter what, right?
It's going to be the same pressure waves, but
Right.
the same tone.
No, tones are just pressure waves.
No, but are you talking about the percept or the stimulus that causes the percept?
Stimulus that causes the percept is the tone. That's what a tone is.
Okay, then in that case, we'll talk about it as pressure waves of sound at 259 hertz. That is going to sound differently depending on your conceptual capacities.
Right. Well, I mean, there's going to be right. I mean, I like metal music. Other people don't. Right. It's going to be cultural. I don't see what problem that has. It doesn't mean I don't hear metal music. Right. Like I know what it sounds like. I know what.
You can recognize it. What it sounds like, what it sounds like to me just amounts to being able to recognize it from the past. But I don't.
I can't. It's not like I could recognize the hertz or whatever. You're right. Like I'm not just.
Oh, recognize the percept. Recognize the percept from your memory. You can access it. So if someone plays middle C on the piano, you can be, or the guitar or E, you can recognize it.
This might it might help me if you sort of clarify exactly what you're trying to say. So, when you say that Mary doesn't learn anything,
Yeah.
right? What do you mean?
Um,
What?
I mean that it's not a matter of learning, it's just a matter of using words in a particular conceptual structure in such a way that you train yourself. So Mary would have to train herself in the Western tonal music system, but she could train herself in another tonal music system that doesn't privilege middle C, that doesn't signify middle C. It's all about conceptual structures. It's all about which conceptual structure you're going to use.
That's fine, right? What does that have to do with qualitative states, right? All you're saying is that the qualitative states someone has depends on the context they're in.
Yes.
Right, but that's not an anti-realism about qualia. Or I guess it is an anti-realism, but it's a relativism about qualitative states, right?
But it also can be an anti-realism if you posit, for example, a child who is 3 months old. Does that child hear qualia? Does that child hear middle C as middle C?
I don't know. That's the same, but like with any private, right? It would just be instrumentally inferred, right? It would be a basic belief because if qualitative states are private, then you're never going to know, right?
No, but I'm saying that even from your perspective, if you try to put yourself in the perspective of a 3-week-old infant and you play middle C, does that infant hear middle C? I mean, you understand? Can we even talk about hearing at that level when at a newborn? Or let's go to a fetus. Does a fetus hear middle C? How this is all context too, because cognitive capabilities matter here in this context. It's not just when you're an adult, or even when you're an adult. If you can't tell the difference between middle C and the D right below it, or the B right below it, then if someone presses plays middle C and then plays a note lower than it, and one doesn't recognize the difference, did that person's qualia change? Even though the wavelength changed.
No, because qualia would be the thing that's the precept, right? I mean, you'd only be looking at behavioral, like you would never know. That's one of those things, right? You'd only be looking at the behavioral cues to identify it, right?
No, but you would know because the person would not be able to ask them which one is different, and the person can't tell the difference.
Right. That's like you'd only be able to know through behavioral cues. That's exactly what I said. You'd only be able to infer through behavioral cues, right? There's going to be a difference in behavior.
Yeah, but in that case, why is it that? So, is there a fact of the matter as to whether that person experienced qualia, a change in qualia, even though you did?
I don't really know.
Well,
Like I mean I don't. That's one of those things that like the nature of qualia. If qualia is private, right? You can't know whether or not they experience. You can only infer based on behavioral patterns, right? Like it's not going to be something that's going to be falsifiable.
but shouldn't it be falsifiable if you're going to posit that you know what it's like, even though you might not be able to recognize a certain. In other words, what is there to know if you can't recognize certain differences, and it's all perceptual? And if you can't recognize those differences,
You don't have to recognize. Like you could just say, right. Well, I mean, it's not going to be something that's going to be a falsifiable hypothesis in the sense that, like, you could just have a robot, for example, which no one's going to say is going to have, most people aren't going to assent that this robot has qualitative states, but you can program it to recognize different tones,
Yeah.
right? And then at a certain wavelength, it's not going to recognize tones, either bass wavelengths or treble wavelengths, right? There's going to be certain wavelengths you're going to be able to program it, and you're just going to say, well, look, it can't. It's going to react behaviorally differently. We know why it will react behaviorally differently, right? But we can't say whether or not it has a qualitative state. We don't even know. Like, most people are going to say it doesn't, but that's just a basic belief. There's no reason. It's not a belief that will be supported by anything. Like, whether or not you have a robot that that hears or sees, right? Like, is not going to be. It's just going to be a basic belief to people. It's not going to be something that's justified by anything.
But if that's the case, then what use does it make? What does it mean to even say then that you know infallibly that you have qualitative states if they're not even meaningless or meaningful concepts? I mean, in what sense do you know that you have qualitative states of sound or any or realistic?
Well, I might just I might be fine with not like using the word no in the proper sense, right?
That's,
I might just say it's a basic belief. It's the same way.
I would say it's an experience, but that's as best as you can get it. Saying that
But experience is going to be synonymous with qualia, right? If you
Yeah,
have experience,
you're
you have
saying it's a belief. A belief is propositional, is necessarily propositional. I would just say it's experience. And experience, and it's all, that's just all what it is. To propositionalize it is to bring it into the realm of, atomizing it and saying there's a discrete fact of the matter, and it brings it into saying that you can know this when, know doesn't even make sense there, so, in that context. So you propositionalize it, and it just kind of blows up after that, because I don't know. When you say you believe even that you have qualitative states, I mean that itself is just an experience, is it not? That's just that.
Right. When you call something an experience, are you leveling the objection that it makes no sense for someone to utter the proposition I experience?
It's just experience.
So the proposition I experience is just is meaningless to you?
It's just experience on its own. You experience yourself. You just it's all.
Right,
all
but you're propositionalizing it right there when you said it, right? You said you're experiencing, or he's experiencing.
Because you have to talk about it. That's the.
Right, but I don't understand what you're saying, because you're saying that, like, look, it can't be talked about. I don't know. I don't understand what the objection is. Are you saying
experience? It's just the experience. It's just the representation of what it is what it is. I guess is what I'm trying to say. It's just whatever the your representation of 261 hertz that you call middle C is just what it is. There's no, you can't get any further than that. It just is what, there's nothing intrinsic about it. There's nothing that you can sort of pull out about it and say, hey, and hold the concept in your hand. And even from your perspective, because if you had an inversion in qualia, I mean, you wouldn't know the difference between.
Right. Well, I already said that. I don't think there's a fact of the matter about what qualitative state is, because the only thing that matters with respect to that, right, is that whether or not you preserve the same dispositions, right? Qualia aren't going to be explanatory. They're not going to explain anything.
Yeah, they're not supposed. I mean.
Yeah, like they can't, because as long as you keep the dispositions the same, then you could exchange any qualia and all the behaviors will be the same, right?
Yeah, but that's why for that same reason, that is why I think that it falls out of the picture in terms of what we can actually intelligibly discuss, because um, when you talk about it as though it's a thing that you can sort of, again, Derezzed used the term have a rigid designators to which you can apply rigid designators, then I mean that is essentially universalizing it. You're on some level you're universalizing it by saying that in his words, there's no possible world in which what he calls red is blue. But I mean, you could just call blue red and red blue. So language, I mean, it's just a language thing. It's just a matter of using language in a certain way for certain percepts. But
Do you remember anything that Yaniv said to you about this?
no, um,
He'd probably be the best to talk to you about this.
I talked. Is he from Israel?
Maybe.
Okay, yeah, I think I've talked to him, but um,
I just know that he knows a lot more. I would have to do a lot of reading because I haven't read anything about. I just go with my intuition.
yeah, I mean that's that. Have you read Daniel Dennett's Qualia?
I haven't.
Yeah, he talks about how he goes into qualia inversion. Ned Block, in one of my videos, I put a clip of Ned Block explaining it in regards to inversion and color. And the thought experiment is basically if someone has an inversion and you have another person who didn't have the inversion, and the normal person whom we would consider normal says, red things look red to me and green to you. The person who had an inversion would say, who are you to say that you're the person for whom red things look red and green things look green? So you're sort of you necessarily have to privilege a perspective when talking about it, but we've already admitted that there is no privileged perspective because of relativism.
Yeah, no, I understand that. Right, and any qualitative state is going to be relative, right?
It's going to be relative to the conceptual structure you bring to the table. That's why we can't hear the differences between other languages. We were talking about emotions and how certain people and groups have emotions that can't be related because of differences in language. So it's kind of just I think there's a sociological aspect of this too, that um, for example, in the Odyssey, the sky is described as gold. Um, in one of the hadiths, a woman's skin is described as green. A battered woman, a woman who's been physically abused by her husband, her skin is described as green. So I, there's a sort of sociology to perception that I think gets left out in these sorts of conversation, and a lot of it has to do with language. But when you sort of take that all out, what are we really talking about? Because I mean, it's so. In other words, it's so relative that it's like nailing Jello to a wall. Anyway, you haven't talked in a long time. So, what's your thought on this?
Oh, had my mic muted. I haven't really been following this what you guys have been talking about because I kind of lost track, right? So,
Well, we were talking about how there's a sort of sociology, um, because it's not about how you or whether or not you know what it's like or know the experience or know the sound or know the color. It's about whether or not it all boils down to whether or not you can use the words correctly. If Mary, so in other words, the question arises: what are we even talking about? Because when you say middle C, even to deploy that concept is it's not only perspective based and perspective dependent, it's not even universal. I mean,
Right.
you're privileging the Western imperialistic, colonial, oppressive, racist system of music classification and tonality over other systems.
Hmm. Well, okay. Just tell me, what exactly do you try to conclude from this?
That the hypothesis of qualia is meaningless.
Okay, and all right. So, what would it take for it to be meaningless? Do you think that it's relative, it's not universal, therefore it's meaningless?
It's relative, it's not universal, it's not even it's relative even from your perspective. It's so it's so dependent on context.
Hmm.
It's it's so dependent on context. It's so dependent on social. It's so sociologically. It's so subject to the vagaries of sociology and culture that when we all boil it down at the end of the day, all it is just a way of organizing our experience so that we don't have a sensory overload.
All
But
right.
the price
But
of that is that we don't make certain conscious significations that others would. Now, Patricia Kuhl at University of Washington, I believe, makes this point very clear that babies are actually much better at behaviorally responding to differences in certain sounds than that we are, but the price they pay is that they don't have a signification of those differences that is conscious enough. Because we have bigger brains and better memory capacities as adults, then we have more conscious. We are more conscious of certain percepts than some babies, but we
all
don't
right.
make the perceptual distinctions that they do.
All right, I understand that, but do you take that to mean that there's no fact of the matter that I'm having a qualitative experience if my experience is dependent on context?
I would say that what you're calling whatever qualitative experience you have, that's just there's nothing intrinsic about it. It's just the way it's represented to you. It just happens to be the way it feels. It or that's a bad scratch that. Don't use that terminology. That's just the experience you're having. The experience is just the experience is just the experience. It's just at the end of the day, it's just raw feels, and then you've built upon that through a conceptual structure, and that is what allows you to sort of talk about what you're
All right,
talking.
all right, yeah, I'm talking about raw feels. Are you saying that there's no fact of the matter that I have a raw feel?
You make it such that there is a fact of the matter, such that even there being a fact of the matter is dependent on context, because how you are.
What do you mean? Like, okay, um, it still seems like to me, at least, that from any context, if someone's having some kind of feeling, he's having that feeling whether I know what it is or not.
But now this is where we have to deconstruct it because it's not as simple as that. Um, what if the person is a 1 year old? Does a 1 year old have that feeling? Does it
Well,
even make
I don't
sense
know.
does it even
Uh,
make sense to talk about
uh,
feelings at that level?
well, I don't know, but I hardly see why that's relevant. If he doesn't have the feeling, he doesn't have the feeling. If he's having a particular feeling, he's having a particular feeling. I
Because because the the what we're talking about what we're talking about what we're talking about with the feeling is the feeling of the feeling that arises because he's learned to make certain significations. That's the only difference is just cognate your conceptual capacities. I in my 90-minute video, I started out with four levels of givens when it comes to qualia. So I did the phenomenological given. That is something where that's qualia that is perspectively irrelevant. So at that point, there's no fact of the matter as to whether or not you're even having qualia because you don't even deploy the concept. So the example I gave is change blindness. Are you following me?
Sort of, yeah.
Okay, so then the next step was the factual given, where this time you're able to react. You're able to there's this sense of signal detection. So, for example, an octopus is the example that I put in that. So there's the signal detection. Then there was the epistemic given, where a theory of mind is established. So you already have a sense of self. There's a sense of I there, but there's no language. But you have a so in that sense, you can actually form a sort of proto-belief about what is happening to you. Then the last step is the linguistic given. This is the most important step. You have a sort of language, a way of organizing the information of reality, and you make certain significations, and that depends on your language, and that language can vary with culture, as you know. There's not a universal language. So your environment also facilitates the schemes that you use to understand whether or not to understand your experience.
Mm-hmm.
So in that sense, the only thing that changed is the conceptual structure at hand and the brain's cognitive capabilities. And because of that, that's really where the qualia arise. It's because you can't, when you boil it all down and you remove all that stuff left, this was Dan Dennett's point, you remove context, you remove language, you remove theory of mind, you removed signal detection and even reaction. What is left?
So how would you tie that back to my point, my original point?
Your original point was that whether or not someone knows he's having an experience, right?
Yeah, what I'm saying is that there can be whether or not that there are various experiences, right? Whether or not different people experience like some kind of physical stimulus differently, there's still something similar between those
No,
different experiences.
no, there's nothing. There's not necessarily, because the hypothesis of relativism of phenomenological relativism allows there to be infinite difference, to be completely, not even similarities, complete differences. Because we're
What
just
do you
talking.
mean?
Well, for example, if there was an alien group that doesn't make distinctions between red and yellow, that's possible, even if they have the cones in their eyes. It's possible that they don't make any distinctions because they might have a language or conceptual scheme that facilitates that. So the
Right, but
possibility.
what I would be talking about here is color itself. I'm not talking about anything particular,
n-
right?
but that's all. I mean, when you talk about color itself, that's just the label that you give to how you represent, how it's represented to you, how electromagnetic radiation is represented to you.
Yeah, okay, sure. And what I'm saying is that no matter how there's still going to be a similarity in that both red and yellow are still going to be some kind of phenomenal experience that would fall under, you know, fall under the category of what we would call color, or
But
what we would call a
that,
visual phenomenal experience.
but that's just a tautology. Basically, what you're saying is color and color. I mean, red and yellow are just names. They're
Yeah,
names.
they're names for experiences.
Yeah, but
right?
that's all classification anyway. So what are you saying?
What I mean is they both fall under a particular type of experience,
Yeah,
right? There's
visual
various
experience.
experiences, right?
Yeah, visual.
But there is, but
Yeah,
there is a fact of the matter as what color in general is. It doesn't need to be the case that like the bottle you mentioned needs to have some. It doesn't need to be the case that it's a particular color, but there can be a fact of the matter that there is color at all, right?
there's a
That
fact of the matter as to, well, even that. You're saying there can be a fact of the matter as to whether or not something is represented to you.
yeah,
But that fact, saying, okay, I understand what you're saying, but the problem with that is that even saying that requires that you have the factual given on some level. It requires that, or to have a belief about that, you have to have the epistemic given. So you have to have the sense of self that allows you to have that, even that belief. And then you need the linguistic given, which allows you to even articulate that you have a belief about that fact that your body is detecting. But when you strip all that down, what you're left with is the phenomenal given, where there is no fact. So even talking about whether or not there's a fact of the matter is dependent on the context of your cognitive capacity.
all right. I'm so sorry. I had to mute my mic. There was a lot of distraction there. I'm sorry. I remember the last thing you said was I had to take into account the various givens you were alluding to earlier.
Yeah, so you had to take into account the factual given that allows for detection in the first place and for you to respond behaviorally to that detection. You have to take into account the epistemic given that allows you to formulate a belief about that thing that your body or your sense organ has detected. Then you
Well,
have to take
wait.
into account the linguistic given that allows you to articulate the belief you have about the fact that about what your sense organ has detected.
Yeah. Sorry, I didn't actually watch your 90-minute video,
That's
so I'm
fine.
not exactly sure what you mean when you talk about given. What exactly is givenness supposed to mean?
Givenness is how vivid a percept is to you. So, for example, if you don't have any language, or rather, I actually made a chart in the video. Do you know who? Let's say, do you know who Philip Glass is?
No.
Okay, let's say Mozart was still alive. Okay,
Mhm.
and you had next there were Mozart was in a room and a 1-year-old child was in a room.
Mhm.
And a fifth grader who learned to play the piano just a year ago is in the room.
Mhm.
And you play middle C
Mhm.
to them, it will be more given to Mozart than it will be to the 1-year-old and the fifth grader. Because Mozart has trained himself for thousands of hours in that particular conceptual structure, so that the vividness with which he hears in middle C will be more heightened than it would be if he had no language and no concept of music.
I'm not sure what you mean by vivid.
How do I put this? Okay, so when you and a an octopus, if you were in a room with an octopus and middle C, the note was played to both of you, your hearing of that. Do octopi have ears? Um, okay, fine. Maybe not an octopus, especially because they live in the water, but maybe a bunny rabbit. They have
Mhm.
ears. If you played middle C, to both of them and expose them to the same pressure waves that are responsible for what you call the percept you call middle C,
Mhm.
it would be more given to you than it would be to the bunny rabbit because you have a sense of self and you have language. And if you're trained in music, it's more given because you're trained in music. You understand?
So, yeah, it's just that it's hard to kind of understand like what givenness would objectively mean. Like, you're saying that the more developed language you have, the more vivid something is,
The
right?
higher your cognitive capacities are, the more given it is. So
Okay, so you're aware of more.
you're aware of it more. So
Okay.
this is the last example I'll give. You are in a room with a Chinese man who speaks only Chinese. You
Mhm.
don't speak a word of Chinese.
Mhm.
And someone comes to you both and speaks to you in Chinese. You
Mhm.
don't understand what he's saying, but the Chinese speaking person who speaks, they both speak Mandarin Chinese.
Mhm.
The Chinese speaking person knows the words coming out of the speaker's mouth are more given to the Chinese man than to you because the Chinese man speaks Chinese.
Okay, I think I understand what you're saying now.
Okay,
So,
so
how would you tie this back into my point
about qualitative,
again? Right, that the fact that there is such a thing as a feeling something.
because even to recognize that, even to propositionally, there's a sort of a quasi-conceptual form of declaration that takes the form of a sentence, which is there is X. There is X. Okay, and that is the factual given where your body is able to respond to a particular environmental stimulus, even though you might not have a sense of self. Then you have the epistemic given, which is about knowledge, which is you have the sense of self, and that allows you to formulate a belief about what you're experiencing. Then you have the linguistic given that allows you to formulate linguistically a belief about what is happening to you. But when you remove all those, what you're left with is you're not left with a fact of the matter as to whether or not there's a qualitative state. You're left with the phenomenal given, which is change blindness, would be an example of the phenomenal given. So
Hmm.
if you have change blindness, does your qualia change? Is there a fact of the matter? Because that's an experience. Is there a fact of the matter when you are blind to whatever?
Hmm. Um, I'm not sure.
Yeah, but the point I'm trying to make is that your conceptual structure is what allows you to establish that there is a fact of the matter in the first place.
Hmm. All right. I guess I'll have to chew on that last point, and I gotta get going
Yeah,
because
I think that was a good
yeah.
point to end on. All right,
Huh?
I think that was a good point to end on.
Yeah. I'll probably have to rewatch this hangout because there was a lot of things you were saying that kind of went over my head.
Yeah,
So I'll try to go through it again.
yeah, that tends.
Sorry, I was just not in my brightest time today. So
Yeah, all right.
see ya.
Thanks. See ya.